Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Quarantini. I am here today with Professor Breanne Fahs, a professor of women and gender studies at Arizona State University, and she is the author of a new book, Burn It Down, Feminist Manifestos for the Revolution, published by Verso Books. And I was looking at your website, and it looks like it might be your 8th book. Is that right?
That's true. Yeah.
Well, so I always like to, especially when I'm talking to scholars or activists, is kind of find out what drove them to first enter their chosen field, whether it was growing up or how did you get involved in studying women and gender studies and also radical feminism?
Well, I mean, it was kind of a thing that I had started super early. So way back in college, I decided that I wanted to double major in psychology and women and gender studies, and then it kind of went from there. But different like subfields that I've gotten interested in sort of happened over time as well. So when I was a grad student, I was really interested in thinking about kind of like the unintended consequences of the sexual revolution and the women's movement, because it seemed like a really like contradictory moment for women at that period. I mean, it still is, but sort of like, early 2000s seemed really confusing in the sense that women were supposed to have all this power and all of this newfound freedom, and yet they were still, reporting like huge instances of faking orgasms and things like that. And I was really interested in kind of thinking through that contradiction. And so my early work really focused on kind of thinking about the whiplash of sexual liberation and from there it grew into a whole other sort of subset of interests. So I became really interested in radical feminism and the history of radical feminism. They thought a lot about sex, obviously, and about sort of women's predicaments with sex, and then that sort of evolved an interest in thinking about sort of key figures of late 1960s and early 1970s feminism. And that sort of kicked off an interest in Valerie Solanas, who I wrote a biography of. And then from there, I became totally obsessed with manifestos. So I guess that's the genealogy of it, at least briefly.
Yeah, and so for a lot of people who, may be listening or watching, who maybe in my generation or even older, who may just be gay men like myself, who might understand what feminism is, maybe even second wave feminism, but what is radical feminism exactly?
Yeah, no, it's really an important distinction that often gets really distorted because we often think about radical as being used to describe something that's extreme, but that's not really what it's designed to be. Radical is really more about thinking about the root structures of something. So rather than looking at within system change, which would be a more liberal feminist approach, in other words, liberal feminists would be interested in how do we fix the existing system as it is, or how do we work with, electoral politics often become like a sort of hallmark feature of liberal feminism, or legal reform. And those are really valid things. This is not to discount that. But radical feminism is much more interested in thinking about what are the root structures of women's oppression or people's oppression in general, and how do we work on thinking about that differently. So understanding it and changing it. So it becomes much more of a sort of big scale sweeping reform. And right now is such a wonderful moment for us to think as radical feminists, right? To think about, huge structural and systematic reforms are already happening. We're sort of questioning the fundamental nature of things that have seemed like just truisms, right? That like aren't anymore. Just that we could pause all student loan debt, for example, is such an interesting moment. Or, that we're rethinking things like housing and kinship and supply systems and everything, right? So these are very inherently like radical moments for us to think in these ways. So radical feminism is interested in thinking about the root structures, and as such it often is very interested, radical feminists are often really interested in thinking about, not just in terms of the systemic sort of issues going on with women, but thinking about, women's sort of fundamental status on the domestic sphere, which right now is totally in ascendancy. We're thinking about this all the time. People are thinking about their domestic lives and the way that oppression is communicated or exists through that. So yeah, I want to make a plug that, a radical feminist lens is necessary and important, I think, for us all right now. And we may already be doing that and thinking in that way without even realizing it. So
right. Yeah, and as a historian, especially one who studies social movements, you realize very quickly in your research that things that were once considered radical are now commonplace. To think that gay marriage would even be an option or something we'd be talking about and even critiqued now as a mode of assimilation back 60 years ago was unthinkable, right? And although I guess that raises other questions about whether that's radical in itself. But one thing you mentioned is we might right now be thinking radically and not even realizing it. And when I was looking through some of your past books, I saw a book titled Transforming Contagion, and I almost screamed because it could not be more relevant than right now. So I'd love to hear kind of the story behind that book and what it's about, and what contagion might mean for us today.
Yeah, I know it does feel like it's getting a fresh revival in my mind as well. So the book is an edited collection that I worked on with 3 of my colleagues, and we were trying to think about how do we imagine contagion beyond the mere biological sort of fact of it and more the social meanings of contagion. So yeah, it's really fun to revisit that book now because the fundamental premises of it are thinking about things like the way that contagion forces us to reckon with the fact that boundaries and borders don't exist in the realm of contagion, right? And right now we're seeing such an interesting moment where all these countries and people and states and cities are trying to establish borders and boundaries, and this contagion has absolutely no regard for that. When we think about the scale of a global pandemic, I mean, some of the early work in that book, I think, was really trying to grapple with that as well. Like, what does it mean, the kind of like social paranoias, or the sense that, we move from physiologically and biologically thinking about contagion to everything feeling contagious right now, so it's sort of, I think it's exciting in some ways to revisit that book. But the collection is a wild sort of romp through different genres and literatures, and there's stuff about like historical pieces, there's literary pieces, there's pieces on gay contagion, which is a really fun chapter. Actually, I love that chapter. There's a piece on teaching manifestos that I wrote in there that's thinking about the contagious aspects of words. I mean, so if you're interested in thinking about contagion more broadly, that book is actually quite fun.
Mm-hmm. And I think especially, younger kids these days, when they think of something that is viral, the first thing that comes to mind is not the bird mask or the death mask, right? It's a good thing. And then suddenly we're seeing something very tangible of how, contagion, we're now going back to the literal sense of it. And one thing I noticed in some of your discussion about it is you talk about how it's raises possibilities for revolution. So how is that something that maybe we should be thinking about now, is whether we're experiencing new possibilities for how society might change?
Yeah, I mean, I think, if we're to like move ourselves away from despair to the extent that we ever can right now, that is how we do it, I think, is to imagine, well, we've already proven and shown that entire systems of the way we do things can topple easily, that they were fragile already, And I think what's interesting about it is to remind ourselves that the systems that we think are impossible to topple are actually quite fragile, and they don't have a lot of substance a lot of the time, just assumptions about the world or how we function. And so right now we have this really small window of time, I think, where we can imagine what kind of society do we want to have, and what are the things that we've assumed we need to spend our time doing that now that we're not doing those, we want to just discard, and what are the things that we deeply and profoundly miss and want back. How can we just fundamentally thinking about themes like housing and kinship and gender relations and, everything. I think we have a chance, parenting, just all of it, education. There's so many things. Healthcare, my God, healthcare. A million revisions to healthcare can happen. So I think, in terms of thinking about, what we have a chance to sort of lobby for the reality that we want now and the world we want in a way that I think would have felt impossible a couple of months ago, or it would have been much more difficult. And I think, just the fragility of capitalism is so refreshing to see, and also to imagine and to know that we can do things differently, right? It's like, the consequences of it are going to be severe and dire and horrible. And at the same time, when we show systems as fragile, we just have entire new inroads to imagine something else and to think about how do we take care of each other? What are our expectations for our government? And What are our financial needs? What are our emotional needs? It's just different. And the caretaking, I think, works differently right now too.
Yeah. And I think also the silver linings that we're seeing, kind of glimmers of what that might look like, whether it's, an actual minimum wage or, getting our $1,200, which we're realizing is nowhere near enough to sustain in the 21st century, not to mention, like you said, healthcare. And I think, I don't know if you've seen the graphic where it shows the list of countries and how many people have lost their healthcare in the past 2 weeks in the middle of the crisis. And it's 0,000 in every civilized country except the United States. So,
I mean, if we're going to rally around, let's say, one revolutionary principle right now, in my opinion, it should be a maximum wage. I mean, that's something we should just be talking about all the time. So I know that's a bit off topic of what we're talking about, but when we think about revolutionary sweeping changes, many other countries have a maximum wage. And if we enact that, if we could push for that, imagine what possibilities we would have, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And so that brings us to your book, Feminist Manifestos for the Revolution. And, of course, I'm familiar with some manifestos, including, Gay Liberation Front, especially you open up with your queer manifestos. But I'm curious, why are manifestos so important, and how did you get so fascinated by them?
Oh, they're so important. They're understudied and underappreciated, I think, but also they just have a quality that is so different than other kinds of writing. They're very emotional. They're very often very angry. They're very revolutionary. They have a kind of impatience. They're very of the moment and of the now. So it's funny how manifestos, you can read them and they feel so timely and so of this moment. And then sometimes they'll go dormant and then they come back to being relevant again, right? So it's like all these manifestos in the book about women talking angrily about domestic life, they suddenly feel like so relevant again. But I think manifestos as a genre, they're just wonderful. They have no regard for citational practice, which as a scholar I think is really interesting and lovely and refreshing. They have no regard for tempered claims. They don't like the, be patient and we'll wait for change to come kind of rhetoric. They are about immediacy and urgency. And so when we read them, I think it really feels like, I don't know, sometimes it feels like getting punched in the face. Sometimes it feels like getting, putting cold water all over you. You're awake. Yeah. They can be sometimes they feel like they're hilarious and sort of funny and you're laughing with them in a wonderful way. Sometimes they just feel like medicines. There's a million uses for them. And I think this collection, I'm trying to include manifestos that don't even agree with each other, that are really about bodies of work that we can kind of read and imagine together. And they should also, I want this book to also feel like you could flip through it and pick any page and you would get something out of it and it would feel like electrifying writing that's sort of jolting you awake. So I think, the manifesto as a genre is really, it's an important one and one that people often don't have a lot of familiarity with. So I'm hoping we can also think of the history of manifestos with regard to feminism.
Yeah, and I was so excited because we just finished up Giovanni's Room by James Baldwin. It was our first quarantini book selection, and in our very first discussion of it, we talked about, in the very first sentence, Baldwin establishes that the narrator is a white guy, and we kind of talked about why he did that. And there was a quote, I think, from a few decades later where he said, I couldn't grapple with more than one, layer of my identity in this novel. I could only do one thing at a time, at least in 1956. And so I assigned over the weekend an interview between him and Audre Lorde, and I was so excited to see the very first epigraph in your book was Audre Lorde. And for people who don't have access to the book yet, hopefully they'll buy it. It says, "It is not the anger of other women that will destroy us, but our refusals to stand still, to listen to its rhythms, to learn within it, to move beyond the manner of presentation to the substance, to tap that anger as an important source of empowerment." And that's from Sister Outsider. And so could you tell me a little bit about Audre Lorde for people who might not be familiar with her and why you chose this really wonderful epigraph?
I mean, you could not say enough about how important Audre Lorde and James Baldwin are. Yep. These are the lions of, the literary world, the critical theory world, they're so important, both of them. So I love, and I had never read that interview before you sent it to me, and it's wonderful. Just listening to the rhythms of their language together was such a, I went to tell you that it was like, that was a delight. That was like maybe the highlight of like my entire week reading that. It was so good. It was so wonderful. But Audre Lorde, yes, she is, one of the scholars and thinkers and poets and writers that we look to think about anger. She has this very kind of loving but unapologetically radical way of thinking about, people's like emotional lives, but also sexuality and, gender and things. And I just, she wrote a piece called The Uses of the Erotic years ago. And I think it's one of the most important pieces that I teach in my sexuality courses, where she's really trying to separate out the notion of the erotic and the pornographic as different, and how the erotic can be used for creative purposes and for, revolutionary purposes, and the pornographic often can't. It's a very like edgy piece, actually, and I love thinking about the way that she's sort of identifying this in her work. But she just has essay after essay after essay about what it means to live, in a very like embodied way as a Black lesbian. And she says so many useful things, at least for the manifesto sort of theme that we're talking about why anger is useful and why it shouldn't be suppressed or, turned away. If we shouldn't turn away from it, that we should think about anger as a useful practice and one that comes from a place of love, right? It's not the opposite of that. It comes from that very place. And I think Audre Lorde is one of those early scholars that's like, doing things that no one else was doing in terms of path-breaking work like that. And I mean, again, when you read the interview with Baldwin, just really trying to deeply understand the Black experience, through the lenses of sexuality and gender, which I think, both her and Baldwin were at the absolute cutting edge of trying to think in those ways. So it was so wonderful to hear them thinking about that together. But yeah, I mean, Lorde is just, she's the queen, we can't, we have to, like, I think treat her work with a sort of just appreciation and reverence that it exists at all, because it feels like a small miracle to me that it exists at all, quite honestly.
Absolutely. And so then the first two manifestos in the book I was so excited about. They're the ones I assigned for anyone who hasn't read them yet. They're up on our website at quarantini.lgbt. I'll make sure they're on the latest posting so you can read it and just get a little bit of a taste of some of the exciting nature of manifestos. But not only are they incredible, but they're also extremely relevant. The first one, I Want a President by Zoe Leonard, from 1990. Of course, it's an election year right now, so I think we've been having some of these conversations about who should be in power and what they should look like. In just the first couple of sentences, it starts with, I want a dyke for president. I want a person with AIDS for president, and I want a fag for vice president, and I want someone with no health insurance, and I want someone who grew up in a place where the earth is so saturated with toxic waste that they didn't have a choice about getting leukemia. And so tell me about Zoe Leonard and kind of the context of this first manifesto.
Yes, I love this manifesto so much. I mean, for one thing, it's a one-page manifesto that honestly, if you read it out loud to yourself, this is medicine. I'm telling you, it just feels like you're so right. I mean, I never get tired of hearing this manifesto. And again, it's just this almost like this one page, like typed out thing. You can see that she's scribbled out errors in the page and replaced them, I mean, and that it also gives you a feel of what manifestos, I think, kind of feel like in their essence, which is like someone sort of firing them off on a typewriter in anger. But yeah, I mean, Zoe Leonard's work, I think, is really important. She's actually a quite well-known artist and has had this piece in various versions. I think at one point she had it installed in this enormous kind of sculpture style thing in New York City that people would walk up and sort of interact with. But I think it works equally well to just, to take it and use it and read it. And, it feels lovely. I loved hearing you read those 3 lines, right? It's just really, it's a fun one, I think, to interact with. But I also like that I sort of crafted this particular section of queer and trans manifestos with this at the beginning, because it seems to me like both, it's like, again, kind of like a jolt of a manifesto. Like you read it and it feels like you feel energized by it, and you feel, I don't know, like you feel her anger and you feel how important it is and how relevant it is. but also it starts out the whole body of work that I'm sort of thinking about in this section, that's thinking about, you know, pain and sadness and anger and fury, you know, going back to, like, again, the early days of AIDS and all the way through, you know. And so I think, you know, Zoe Leonard is a nice sort of, you know, gateway drug to the rest of that section.
I love it put that way. And then the second one, also in the context of the middle, the height of the AIDS crisis, is the Queer Nation Manifesto, which, as you know, was originally passed out by people marching with the ACT UP contingent during Gay Pride in 1990. And that one, it's a bit longer, and it starts, I honestly got pretty emotional reading it, because it is just so much has changed, yet so little has changed. And I think the words just, especially, it seems like it was multiple writers. I had never read it before now. And it starts, "How can I tell you? How can I convince you, brother, sister, that your life is in danger? That every day you wake up alive, relatively happy, and a functioning human being, you are committing a rebellious act. You, as an alive and functioning queer, are a revolutionary." So
yes,
it's just, I mean, some of the most incredible opening lines, probably second or equal to Zoe Leonard's. But so I also was very excited by how relevant it is, because just a couple weeks ago, the very, very first assignment of our little book and film club, Quarantini, was to watch How to Survive a Plague. And one of the central figures of that is ACT UP member Peter Staley. So our first guest was him, and he's doing very well. I think he's holed up somewhere upstate New York right now. But he was talking to us about, you know, Dr. Fauci, for example, and some of the same concepts of how, you know, really scary times can open up, you know, opportunities for revolution. But tell me about, you know, this manifesto and, you know, what came of it.
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right that I feel that we are not going to be able to get through this if we don't look back and see how people got through the HIV epidemic, and how the early days of AIDS and ACT UP, and the radicalism of that moment was in so many ways a transformative thing for how everything that we know and did about AIDS later started from, right? And so that's, I think, the fallacy that we often get into, is we think that, well, you know, science is sort of neutral, and, you know, that we don't need advocacy and activism to get this science out and to get, you know, resources to people. Of course, I mean, you know, any of us who've, like, really experienced any of those things before understand this is not how it works. Like, everything about this virus now, we are going to need to have radical voices and advocates, and we're going to need to look back at ACT UP, I think, in whole new ways. So I do think this is the moment to look back at this particular manifesto again, and to see it, you know, not just as a sort of historical document, but to feel its aliveness and its freshness again today, right? I mean, if you think about, like, I don't know, the pain of those years, right? And the ways in which this manifesto speaks to that, but is also trying to call upon the reader to imagine themselves written into it. I think you're right. That's why it probably feels emotional to read it. It feels emotional to me to read it too, for that reason, because it's sort of calling us out as individuals to take not only personal responsibility, but to, like, join in these collectives in terms of, well, what are we going to do to, like, stop people from dying, you know? And people are and will die because of the political decisions that are being made right now. And we can't lose sight of that in our grief and our despair, that we need also to have anger. I feel like we're in a mode right now of feeling a lot of fear. You can see that in the manifesto too. I think they don't discount the role of fear and grief, because fear and grief are very important themes that we're going to work through right now with what we're going through. But I think if we lose sight of the anger that we should feel and can feel, especially collectively, we are in deep trouble, because this is not just about fear and sadness and grief. It's also about how are we going to hold people accountable and, you know, push them as a group, as individuals and as a group, to do better, you know? And, like, I mean, the pain and tragedy, of course, of the Trump era is unfolding in ways that I think none of us could ever quite have imagined. Like, we all know it's bad, but we never quite imagined that it would be this bad, right? Where, you know, he's, like, praising himself for only 100 to 200,000 people dying. That is the craziest. That feels like otherworldly, and it's like absolute callousness, right? Or bragging about models when he's talking about death. So, I mean, and on. We don't need to get into that because I know that's like a terrible rabbit hole of its own. But this manifesto will feel like it is for you now. That's what makes it so powerful and wonderful. But it also is a moment to think back about what do we need to learn from ACT UP and from the early AIDS activism that's going to get us through this moment, because we're not going to get through it without that, I think. Really. I mean, I'm completely serious. You know, we have to learn those lessons, you know, from the people who survived that and went through that so that we don't repeat the same mistakes, you know?
Right. And reading it now, I think, telling us how, you know, even if we may feel safe right now as, you know, I'm a white guy, you know, in Los Angeles with, you know, an apartment, and it's reminding us like what is at stake. And also that we're part of, even if we feel like we're not oppressed, we're still part of a community that is oppressed in several different ways right now. And also from having started kind of this platform and having a diverse audience of especially of gay men across different generations, one thing that I really liked about this manifesto was that it addressed the word queer, and it's one of the better, at least primary sources that explains why using that word is so important, because I still get messages every week from older men who survived, you know, the AIDS crisis, who survived the lavender scare, who say, you know, that word is triggering to me. And I think especially the quote in the manifesto that says, yeah, queer can be a rough word, but it also a sly and ironic weapon that we can steal from the homophobe's hands and use against him. And then on top of that, just how it is also more inclusive of a word than gay or any of the other words that we might be used to, I think is really reassuring and empowering. And so I'd suggest if anyone is struggling with, you know, the use of that word doesn't really, you know, it still hurts. I would highly suggest going into this manifesto and reading it, because you'll come out of it saying, yeah, I'm here and I'm queer.
Yeah. And I love also that this manifesto, and actually many of them in this section too, are thinking about the fundamental political importance of solidarities, right? That like it's all hands on deck time. And I feel like when it comes to, you know, surviving a plague, this is really necessary, that, you know, we want everyone who is going to like be in this fight together to be in it, even if they have like very different ways of seeing the world or experiencing language or, you know, identifying, etc. Like it's all about alliances and solidarities now. And, you know, I think, again, that back to the whole question of the early work that I've done on contagion, right? Contagions do not have any regard for these sort of separations between people and the boundaries that we produce. So our resistances have to mimic that as well, you know? And I think, you know, we are called forth to do that. Like, how are we going to also operate in whole new forms and styles of solidarities, even when we're separated and, you know, Zoom calling each other and all of this, you know?
Right. And also, you know, I think exactly what you said about, you know, borders and how contagion has no regard for these artificial boundaries that we construct. It gives us this tangible proof that, you know, as much as you want to call it the Chinese virus, right? Or, you know, AIDS originally was GRID, G standing for gay. You know, it's all fake, and we have no choice but to see that these boundaries that we've raised, these walls that we've raised, are at the end of the day just hurting us. And so, yeah, highly recommend both of these first two. And also, there are so many more in the book. Do you have any other favorites that you would suggest for anyone listening?
There's so many that I love. I mean, it's almost like it depends on like your mood at any given moment. But yeah, I mean, it's like, you know, there's some sort of funky, like manifesto-ish poems in there that are kind of lovely. You know, there's like a whole bunch of ones about sex. So depending on, you know, your particular mood for that, like I'm saying right now, I'm absolutely loving the ones that are thinking about domestic conditions, like housework. And I mean, those ones just feel like alive again to me. Of course, you know, I absolutely love the Scum Manifesto for its absurdity and, I don't know, that weird line that it walks between, is this satire or did she mean it? I mean, that's one I've worked on for years. So that one I love thinking about. There's also, I think my favorite section just as a whole is, although I don't know for sure, but I think it might be the section on trash. So there's like a bunch of ones thinking about kind of class-based rage and, people sort of like looking at trashing different institutions or using trashy language or trashy embodiment. Like that stuff I think is really fun. I always love the feminist hackers. They get back to you immediately when you email them. It's really funny. They're always online. It's lovely. But the feminist hackers are pretty badass too. So, there's just a lot. There's a lot going on in there. And then, of course, the collection ends with a section called Witchy Bitchy, and it definitely is that. There's all sorts of manifestos about witchiness and bitchiness in there. So I don't know. I hope the readers will like and will buy and like this book. I think it'll be relevant right now, maybe more than ever. So
definitely. I mean, and I was, just skimming through all the different options, and you have, like I said, the Gay Liberation Front, the Radical Lesbians, which are one of my favorite manifestos, and then going all the way up to, the Trans Feminist Manifesto, Black Lives Matter. And that kind of raises my next question is looking forward. What do you see in the future of manifestos, and especially now in this digital confined contagion era?
God, I love when people write manifestos, and I actually think it may be even a better solution than trying to like meditate and journal and reflect right now, but that's my like deranged brain. I think manifestos can be weirdly therapeutic. They help us to focus our energy and attention. I hope that there will be lots of them that come out of this era. And then remember, manifestos do not need to be written by only individuals. You can write them as a group. They have a weird sort of shelf life that lasts longer than one would think, and that feels relevant for longer. And they feel like truer than other kinds of writing too. So I would encourage people to try it. There's lots of different aspects of writing them that can be a little bit strange. But remember, it's a genre that's not about, you don't have to cite other people. You don't have to be historically minded. You can write of the now, about right now, in a state of fury. And the only real requirements for manifesto writing are a very frank sense of emotionality and a sense of nowness. Maybe you could add to that a sense of againstness. So what are you working against, or what are you trying to sort of fight back against? So if you kind of keep those things in mind, like all possibilities are there. But yeah, I hope we're going to see, I bet we will see a sort of increase in revolutionary and radical documents in general right now. And I'm excited to read them and interact with them whenever possible.
Absolutely. And so the book is Burn It Down, Feminist Manifestos for the Revolution. If one of our listeners wants to acquire it, what is the best way for doing that?
Just go directly to Verso Books. Right now they're running like a 40% off all books for the reading in the time of coronavirus promotion, but they often have great promotions, and they're it's really straightforward and easy to get the book that way. Right now, I don't think any of us should be trusting Amazon and stuff, but you could always give that a whirl. And a best option actually is to try to order it from your local bookstore. A bunch of local bookstores are doing cool things, like you can drive up and get bags of books. They're doing delivery. They'll coordinate with each other to get what you need to you. So, if you can keep supporting local bookstores, that would be ideal, because we're seeing what happens when we rely on things like Amazon too much, right? It's just like falling apart at the seams. Again, one of those fragile institutions that we never thought that would happen. So I hope you'll get it. It's really it's a fun book right now to interact with.
Yeah, and so that's versobooks.com, and I think I saw it was 40% off the print, and then the ebook is just $2 and you can read it on any device. Does that sound right?
Yeah, I don't know how long that'll last, but that's pretty. They're doing 80% off all their ebooks.
You need some a way to funnel what maybe your fear, your anger, your frustration into something productive. I think this is such an amazing a collection of templates, right, of how we can channel that and all these emotions we're feeling while cooped up in our apartments. But Professor Breanne Fahs, thank you so much for joining us. I think, it's if there's anything history tells us, it's that, we've made it this far. We've overcome enough scary things in the past. We can certainly overcome this and also build a better world.
Yeah, we're going to make something new if we're lucky.
Great. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you so much.